Everybody to the April 13th Gaming Advisory Commission. This should be our final meeting going over the applications that were submitted for the 2023 gaming grant. Why don't we start with roll call? Miller?
Here.
Alexander? Solno?
Here.
Edwards?
Here.
Farrell?
Here.
Flores?
Here.
Rakos? Here. Zaney?
Here.
Venez?
Here.
Wielgus? And Talon here. So if I did that, I believe that's 9 present and 2 absent. Yes, correct. All right. So being it's our final meeting, we had a work study session right before this. We're going to go over the final applications that we haven't talked about in our 2 previous meetings. And then at the end, we'll have hopefully an official motion to approve the grants for this year's recipients. So with that, we had 2 homework assignments from the last meeting that we'll start with. One was the Greater Deliverance COCIC America Health and Social Services Network. What we did is we spoke to our Community Development Director, who is Awana Miller, who obviously works with all the not-for-profit organizations in the city of Hammond. We had seen in the application that there were duplication of services for a lot of other organizations that do some of the same things, but we wanted to check with her. She was not familiar with the organization. So at this time in work study, we did decide to pass on a grant for this organization. However, Awana Miller, the Community Development Director for the City of Hammond, is going to reach out to them and see if we get acquainted with them and learn more about them so that maybe next year if they apply again, we might do something different. Secondly, we were looking into the Lake County Fire Chiefs Association. This is a group, the CEO is David Wise, who's a Hammond fireman, and we wanted to find out more about what they were needing the money for and to make sure that it is being used in the city of Hammond, since all of our grants are really directed to city of Hammond residents and services. So with this particular one, after speaking to Ron Novak, our environmental director, and also our fire chief Smith, and I actually spoke to Dave Wise, I was told that this group does offer services for hazmat situations that our fire department is not able to handle sometimes. So this would be used for the city of Hammond. And so with that, speaking to our group, they did make a request of $10,000. Did we have a recommendation?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recommend $5,000 this year, given our funding situation.
So we have a recommendation for $5,000. Do we have any other discussion? Everybody's in agreement? Mm-hmm. Okay, we would mark them down for $5,000. They also said that they do request funding from all the other municipalities that are out there as well. So it's not just us that are donating, which is always good. Okay, now we're on to today's applications. We are at New Hope 2 Community Center. They made a request for $32,500. Did not see a grant made for last year. It says that the purpose of their funding is to tuck pointing and painting and property renovations that are needed for their site. Several of us, I think almost everybody, was familiar with what they do and some of the services that they provide to the community. So with that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend we give them $5,000.
Okay, we have a recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion?
No.
Very good, $5,000. As we're going through, as we talk, we did have a work study session before this, and we did come up with a number at the end, and I'll give a little bit more information about that, but we'll discuss some changes we had to make after obviously being a little over the approved amount that we had this year. So I just want to bring that up now. The next one is the Northwest Indiana Rugby Football Club. They asked for a grant amount of $2,500. Obviously, this is for their program that is in the city of Hammond. I know they were working at Riverside Park, I believe, is where they actually operate their program. So with that, do we have a recommendation from the group?
Mr. President, I recommend the $2,500 for the Rugby Football Club.
We have a recommendation for $2,500. Is there any other discussion?
I agree.
All right, we will mark them for $2,500. Next, we have the Northwest Indiana Symphony Society. This is a group, I think it's a subsidiary of South Shore Arts, run by Dave Micah. The purpose of their funding is very lengthy, but it talks about education concerts each year for upwards of 6,000 students from across the region. So obviously this ties into South Shore Arts and what their mission is as well. So with that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I would suggest we allot them $5,000.
Recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion? Is everybody in agreement?
Yes.
Yes.
We will mark them down for $5,000. Prom Genie, an organization many of us are familiar with. Last year, we gave them a grant of $10,000. This year, they requested $15,000, and the purpose of their funding is for receiving dresses and using them for girls, I believe, that are not able to afford dresses for certain events. So it's a good organization that many of us are familiar with. I think I actually attended their annual dinner last year, but I'm not part of the organization. I don't want to confuse people. Do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I recommend 10,000.
We have a recommendation for $10,000, same grant as last year. Any further discussion?
We agree.
Agree.
Okay, 10,000 it is. I will mention that Councilwoman Alexander has joined us. So going forward, we have 10 present and 1 absent. Next, we are on the Pulaski Park Neighborhood Association. They received $15,000 last year. This year, they made a request for $25,000. Melissa Farrell will be recusing herself from voting on this or making any recommendations on amounts because she is the CEO of the organization. How will the purpose of their funding is the 4 raised planters within Pulaski Park at the corners of Grover and 138th and Grover and 139th. Require soil removal and repair. Also plant replacement for the median between Homan and Sheffield and the median area between Johnson and Henry at 139th. Also needs a new plan and requires repair, and there's other activities listed as well. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend $15,000 this year due to some limited funding.
So we're recommending $15,000 because of limited funding. Is there any other discussion? Okay, $15,000 it is. The Rotary Club of Hammond, I don't see a grant listed for last year, but this year they only requested $3,000. Many of us are very familiar with the Rotary Club and some of the services that they provide. So they talk about community services such as environmental cleanups, sending children in urban communities to leadership camps, donations such as supplies, clothing, food to shelters, schools, and retirement communities. Do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I would suggest we give them a full $3,000.
Recommendation for the full $3,000. Is there any other discussion?
No.
Very good. We will mark them down for $3,000. Next is St. Casimir School. Last year, we did a grant of $10,000. This year, they made a request for $16,720. The purpose of their funding is for focusing on enhancing safety through better communication and building facility upgrades, among other listed activities and services. And I think we had done $5,000 for other schools. I could be wrong, but that's my recollection. But do we have a recommendation for St. Casimir School?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I recommend that we remain consistent and grant St. Casimir $5,000.
We have a recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion?
No.
Okay, we'll approve them for $5,000. Next, we have St. Joseph Catholic Church. They received a grant of $5,000 last year. They asked for another grant of $5,000 this year. The primary services they provide, obviously, this is where they have a soup kitchen in downtown Hammond. And so I'm assuming they are looking for funding for those services. With that, do we have a recommendation from the group?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I recommend that we give them 5,000 last year.
Recommendation to match the $5,000 that we did last year and for what they're requesting. Is there any other discussion? Are we all in agreement?
Agreed.
Yes.
Okay. St. Joseph will get $5,000. We have the School City of Hammond robotics program. Last year, we gave them a grant of $30,000, and this year they made a request for $40,000. They are, we've talked quite a bit about this organization every year at this group. We know they do a fantastic job with their program. Many times in the past, they've taken first place in the robotics competition. So they talk about registration fees, transportation, lodging, material supplies, among other costs. Do we have a recommendation for this program?
Mr.
President,
Yes.
I recommend that we grant them the 30,000 for their program.
We have a recommendation for $30,000. Are we all in agreement with that?
Yes.
We will approve them for $30,000. Society of St. Vincent de Paul, OLPH. Last year, they requested, we gave them a grant of $1,000. This year, they requested a grant of $2,000. They provide food and financial assistance for medicine, housing, utilities, and car repair. And they're specifically using this grant, would use this grant for the purchase of food for their food pantry and financial assistance for housing and utilities. Do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend that we give them the full 2,000.
Recommendation for $2,000. Is there any other discussion? We're all in agreement?
Yes.
Okay, $2,000 it is. South Shore Arts, Inc. Last year, we gave them a grant of $5,000. This year, they made a request of $25,000. I think the name of the organization talks kind of specifically about what the purpose of their funding is. They have a scholarship program that they use for 4th and 5th graders. They also want to have some summer teen art board recruiting activities, and that's for other grades as well, not just 4th and 5th. I don't want to confuse people. And then they have 10-week sessions of art and music classes that they work together with the Boys and Girls Club and with Hammond YMCA. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I would suggest we award them $5,000 as we did last year.
We have a recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion? Very good. We will mark them down for $5,000. The Culture Barber College submitted an application. However, this program is for not-for-profit organizations, and in the box, they check that they are for-profit. So with that, we cannot give them a grant, so we're going to go ahead and put pass on the Culture Barber College. Next is the Gatehouse Hammond. Last year, they received a grant of $5,000. This year, they're asking for $15,000. Purpose of their funding is the money will go for gas and repair for the maintenance of their vehicles, and their homes also have therapy animals, so the money can help with the care and upkeep of those animals. They also take ladies on spiritual retreats and would like to provide the funds for women that are unable to pay for themselves. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, at this time, I'd like to make a recommendation of $5,000.
We have a recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion?
Agreed.
All right, we'll mark them down for $5,000. We have the Welcome Network. Last year received a grant of $4,000. This year, they asked for a grant of $5,000. The purpose of their funding is TWN has assisted more than a half dozen Ukrainian families arriving in 2022 through the government's United for Ukraine program. They have assisted these families at their Hammond office. They'd like to continue to be actively involved in these government programs, both through resettlement-type services and the DOJ-accredited legal services, among other activities. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend that we keep it the same 4,000 as we did last year.
We have a recommendation for $4,000, same grant as last year. Is everybody in agreement?
Yes.
All right. Toll Performing Arts, last year received a grant of $25,000. This year is asking for $50,000. The primary services they provide are for, they have plays at their facility in downtown Hammond, which is owned by the city of Hammond, or will be soon, actually. It's managed by the Hammond Development Corporation. We're all very familiar with Toll. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President,
Yes.
yes, I recommend $20,000 for the toll.
We have a recommendation for $20,000 for Toll. Is there any other discussion?
Agreed.
All right, we will approve for $20,000. Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church, last year, a $2,000 grant was awarded. This year, they asked for another $2,000 grant. They used their money for a number of different activities. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I agree that we give them the 2,000, the same as last year.
Recommendation for $2,000, their full grant amount. Is there any other discussion? We will mark them down for $2,000. United Citizens Association, Inc. Last year, I don't see a grant amount, but I feel like there was one. But this year, they made a request for $10,000. They're requesting financial assistance to maintain aesthetic improvements in the Robertsdale community. This year is to focus on repair and restore from prior projects. And they give a number of different projects that they work on and focus on. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President?
Yes.
I recommend that we give them the full 10,000.
We have a recommendation for $10,000. Is there any other discussion?
I agree.
Agree.
All right, then we will mark them down for $10,000. Next, we have United Way of Northwest Indiana. I have to recuse myself from voting and/or talking about the financial amount for this group, as I am a board member. They made a request this year of $55,000. I think many of us are familiar with Lake Area United Way, so I won't go into all their activities or take up the rest of the meeting time. But do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend that we pass. They're a wonderful group. However, they have a lot of large corporate sponsors, and I would like to keep the dollars more close to home and focus on the smaller groups.
So we have a recommendation to pass, being that they are a larger organization and has a lot of other funding sources. Do we have any other discussion on that?
I agree.
Very good. We will mark that down to pass. Next, we have the Whiting-Hammond Knights of Columbus. They had a grant last year of $5,000. This year, they made a request for $10,000. The purpose of their funding is for their annual pierogi drop that occurs in the city of Hammond, Indiana. Do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I recommend we grant them $5,000.
We have a recommendation for $5,000. Is there any other discussion? Okay, we will mark them down for $5,000 as we did last year. Whiting Robertsdale Chamber of Commerce, they received a grant of $10,000 last year. They requested $25,000 this year. The purpose of their funding is funds we use to help defray the cost of producing and delivering the Right Stuff newspaper to Hammond residents. And they list that Whiting does help them with a cost for their Whiting residents, as well as to support events such as Pierogi Fest and other community events and activities. They also have a monthly program on WJOB, and they list a few other activities. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, I would suggest we award them $10,000 as we did last year.
We have a recommendation to match our last year's grant for 10,000. Is there any other discussion?
No.
Very good. We'll mark them down for 10,000. Next is the Whiting-Robertsdale Community Improvement Corporation. I don't see them from last year, but this year they have a request for $5,000. They say the purpose of their funding is a committee that has run from the city and would help close the funding gap that they are experiencing for their organization. I don't have specific purpose of funding in front of me, but with that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President, at this time, given our limited funds, I would like to pass on this organization for this year.
Okay, we have a recommendation to pass. Is there any other discussion? Okay, we will mark down pass right now. Next, we have the Whiting-Robertsdale Historical Society. I don't think they made a grant request last year. This year, they requested $10,000. However, I will note that we do have a Hammond Historical Society that we work with as well. Do we have a recommendation from the group?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I recommend that we pass on, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I recommend that we pass on this grant since we do have a Hammond Historical Society.
Very good. So I think, and my guess is that, because obviously Robertsdale, so they're saying they're partially Hammond as well, is that our Hammond Historical Society will work together with theirs to make sure that any Hammond groups are being, or historical information is being worked on as well. So is there any other discussion on that?
No.
Okay, very good. Last, certainly not least, we have the World's Fastest Triathlon, LLC, also known as Leon's Triathlon. They received a grant of $15,000 last year. They requested a grant of $15,000 this year. I think everybody from this area is very familiar with the event that Leon puts on this year, and also some of the things that he does with the veterans in this area, which he works very closely with. With that, do we have a recommendation?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I would recommend $15,000.
We have a recommendation for $15,000. Is there any other discussion?
I agree.
Very good. We will mark them down for 15. That concludes the grant applications. So I want to share with everybody that after we added up all the grant requests that we had done from day one and day two and today, earlier, we actually were approximately about 60,000 higher than what we were able to do. So we did have to go through and make some changes to some of the earlier grant recommendations that were made. So if people are watching this, even though you may have heard a different number early, we did make some changes in the work study session. And of course, we hate doing it, but we only have a limited amount of resources, and we try and be fair to everybody who submits. So with that, at this time, I'm going to read off each organization and the amount that this committee has recommended. And then at the end, I'm going to word this in a way that it would be a motion. And then at the end, we would need somebody to so move the motion, if we feel comfortable doing so. So I will start now. The motion we are looking for would be the following. And I will word it this way. The motion would be to recommend the following grants amounts for each organization that I'm listing. So first would be American Legion Hammond Post 168 for $6,500. American Veterans Collection, Inc. for $3,000. Anthem Church for $5,000. Arts Hammond Association for $5,000. Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative, $600. Bishop Knoll Institute, $5,000. Books, Brushes, and Bands for $20,000. Boys and Girls Club of Northwest Indiana for $9,700. Challenger Learning Center of Northwest Indiana for $15,000. Community Center Development Corporation, Ophelia Steen Center for $15,000. Four Quarters for Life for $4,700. Friends and Family of Northwest Indiana, Inc. for $10,000. Genesius Guild for $5,000. Girls on the Run of Northwest Indiana for $7,500. Greater Hammond Community Service, Inc. for $15,000. Habitat for Humanity Northwest Indiana for $5,000. Hammond Boxing Club for $20,000. Hammond Central Softball Team for $5,000. Hammond Community Theater for $5,000. Hammond Community Watch for $25,000. Hammond Hermits Athletic Association for $10,000. Hammond Hispanic Community Committee for $3,000. Hammond Hurricanes for $5,000. Hammond Mohawks ACC for $8,000. Hammond Mohawks Athletic and Conservation Club for $3,000. Hammond Optimist Youth Sports for $10,000. Hammond Public Library Foundation for $1,999. Hammond Reads, Inc. for $10,000. Hammond Youth Golf Academy First Tee Program, $10,000. Haven House, $15,000. Hessville Community and Commerce Creative, also known as HC3, for $20,000. Hessville Little League for $10,000. Homestead Enterprise Housing, Inc. for $5,000. Hope Center of Northwest Indiana for $5,000. Humane Indiana for $5,000. Intermission, Inc. for $5,000. Impact, Inc. for $10,000. Jalen L. Hunter Foundation, Inc. for $5,000. Lake County Fire Chiefs Association, Inc. for $5,000. Mental Health America of Northwest Indiana for $15,000. Montessori Children's Schoolhouse for $5,000. Mount Zion Drive, A.R. Burns Pleasant View Plaza for $9,875. New Hope Baptist Church College Day for $2,000. New Hope 2 Community Center for $5,000. Northwest Indiana Rugby Football Club for $2,500. Northwest Indiana Symphony Society, Inc. for $5,000. Prom Genie for $10,000. Pulaski Park Neighborhood Association, Inc. for $15,000. Rotary Club of Hammond for $3,000. St. Casimir School for $5,000. St. Joseph Catholic Church for $5,000. School City of Hammond Robotics for $30,000. Society of St. Vincent de Paul, OLPH, for $2,000. South Shore Arts, Inc. for $5,000. The Gatehouse Hammond, Inc. for $5,000. The Welcome Network for $4,000. Toll Performing Arts Company for $20,000. Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church for $2,000. United Citizens Association, Inc. for $10,000. Whiting Hammond Knights of Columbus for $5,000. Whiting Robertsdale Chamber of Commerce for $10,000. And the World's Fastest Triathlon LLC, $15,000. Do we have a motion for that?
Mr. President.
We have a motion to approve all those organizations and the amounts just listed. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Let's do a roll call vote. Miller?
Yes.
Alexander?
Yes.
Zolno?
Yes.
Edwards?
Yes.
Farrell?
Yes.
Flores?
Yes.
Rakos?
Yes.
Zaney?
Yes.
Vines?
Yes.
Wheelgus? Talon? Yes. That's 10 approved, 1 absent. Congratulations to the Hammond Gaming Advisory Commission for all your hard work. Congratulations to all the organizations that are going to be receiving dollars from the 2023 gaming grant. We really appreciate everything you do. And it's always hard for us as we get to the point, and there's additional dollars that more needed than what we have available. But we promise you, we do everything we can to assist the organizations because we know how important it is for the city of Hammond. So with that, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Meeting adjourned.